I'm going to start with the obvious answer because I think it deserves its place at the top of this conversation, which is Porsche. Porsche is in a category basically by itself when it comes to design consistency, and the reason is the 911. The 911 has been in continuous production since 1963, and if you line up every single generation of it, every single one, from the original 901 to whatever they're making right now, the through line is unmistakable. The round headlights, the sloping roof line, the wide rear haunches over the engine, the overall silhouette that somehow manages to look both retro and contemporary at the same time, regardless of when you're looking at it. Porsche has updated the 911 many times. New platforms, new engines, new technology, massively different performance. But the shape has evolved so gradually and so deliberately that each generation looks like a natural, inevitable progression from the one before it. That's extraordinarily difficult to do. Most manufacturers redesign a car, and the new version looks like a completely different car. Porsche redesigns the 911 and it looks like the same car grew up a little. But here's what makes Porsche's consistency even more impressive. It's not just the 911. The design language has bled across the entire lineup in a way that few brands manage. The Cayenne, which is an SUV, which should theoretically have nothing to do with a rear-engined sports car, manages to look like a Porsche. The Macan looks like a Porsche. The Panamera, which is a four-door saloon, looks like a Porsche. You might not love all of those cars, and plenty of people have strong opinions about whether Porsche should be making SUVs at all, but from a pure design consistency standpoint, the family resemblance is there. The proportions, the surfacing, the headlight graphics, it all speaks the same language. That's really hard to pull off across segments that different, and Porsche does it better than almost anyone. The one critique you could level at Porsche is that the consistency comes partly from a kind of design conservatism. The 911 doesn't change dramatically because Porsche is genuinely committed to the heritage, but also because changing it too much would be a commercial disaster. So some of the consistency is strategic caution as much as design philosophy. I think that's worth acknowledging. But even with that caveat, the result speaks for itself. If someone shows you a Porsche you've never seen before, you know it's a Porsche. That's the test, and Porsche passes it every time. Now let's talk about Lamborghini, because Lamborghini represents a completely different approach to design consistency that's equally valid and arguably even more visually dramatic. Where Porsche's consistency is about evolutionary refinement, gradual, careful, deliberate. Lamborghini's consistency is about a design philosophy so extreme and so committed that it basically can't be mistaken for anything else. The wedge. Everything at Lamborghini, or almost everything, comes back to the wedge. The wedge as a design philosophy was basically invented at Lamborghini. The Miura started it, the Countach perfected it, and every Lamborghini since has been in conversation with that shape in some way. The low nose, the aggressively raked windscreen, the sharp angular surfaces that catch light differently from every angle, the overall impression of something that's moving even when it's standing still. That's the Lamborghini design vocabulary, and it's been remarkably consistent for about 50 years. You look at a Huracan, and you see the Countach. You look at an Aventador, and you see the same DNA. Even the Urus, which is an SUV, and therefore the biggest challenge to the design language, manages to carry enough of the angular aggression that you know what brand it is. It doesn't look like a wedge. It can't, it's a tall SUV. But it looks like the same design team made it, which is the important thing. What Lamborghini does brilliantly is use surface complexity as a brand identifier. Other cars are smooth. Lamborghini cars are full of creases and vents and scoops and angles that seem almost excessive until you see them in person and realize they're all serving the overall visual effect of something genuinely threatening. That's a consistent design philosophy, even if the specific elements change between models. The commitment to visual aggression is the constant. The interesting comparison to make at this point is Ferrari, because Ferrari and Lamborghini are obviously in the same segment, they're obvious rivals. And the question of which one has more consistent design language is genuinely contested. I'd argue Ferrari's consistency is actually weaker than Lamborghini's. And here's why. Ferrari has produced some of the most beautiful cars ever made. Nobody is arguing against that. But the design language has shifted more dramatically over the decades, and the current lineup, if I'm honest, is harder to pin down than you might expect. The Roma doesn't look that much like the SF90. The Puro Sangue, which is their SUV, looks more like a generic luxury GT than something with strong Ferrari DNA. The prancing horse on the badge is doing a lot of work that the design itself isn't always doing. Lamborghini's design language feels more internally consistent to me, even if Ferrari's individual cars are often more beautiful. That said, Ferrari does have some very strong visual anchors. The circular taillights are genuinely iconic, and they've maintained that element for a long time. The proportions of their mid-engine cars are consistently excellent. And the prancing horse itself is probably the most recognizable automotive logo on the planet, which contributes to the sense of brand identity even when the design language is doing less work. So it's complicated. Ferrari's brand identity is incredibly strong. Whether their design language is as consistent as Lamborghini's is more debatable. Let me move on to a brand that I think is underappreciated in this conversation, which is Alfa Romeo. Or more specifically, I want to talk about what Alfa Romeo was and what it's becoming, because those are two very different stories. The classic Alfa Romeo design language, the one from the 50s through to the early 2000s, was one of the most distinctive and beautiful in automotive history. Organic flowing surfaces, that famous triangular grille, an overall aesthetic that looked like it evolved naturally rather than being designed, which is an incredibly difficult thing to achieve. Cars like the Giulia Sprint, the Spider, the Montreal, the 75. These are cars with a very clear design philosophy running through all of them. You could argue that the old Alfa Romeo had some of the strongest design language of any manufacturer from that era. The problem is what happened next. Alfa Romeo spent a long and somewhat painful period in the 2000s and early 2010s producing cars that didn't really have a clear design identity, and some of them were frankly forgettable in a way that felt almost criminal given the brand's heritage. The Maitu and the Giulietta were fine cars, but they didn't really look like Alfas. They looked like European hatchbacks with an Alfa badge. The more recent Alfa Romeos, the Giulia, the Stelvio, the 33 Stradale are much better. The current design direction is more coherent and more connected to the brand's history. But it's still not as consistent as the Golden Era, and the newer mass-market products like the Junior feel more like they're relying on the grille shape to do the brand identity work, rather than having a fully developed design language throughout the car. So Alfa is interesting. Historically excellent, currently improving, but not quite at the top of this conversation yet. Now I want to spend some time on BMW, because BMW is probably the most complex case study on this entire list. And the reason is that BMW used to be one of the gold standard examples of design consistency, and now they're one of the most debated brands in this conversation. For a long time, roughly from the E30 era through to the early 2000s, BMW was doing something really impressive. The kidney grille was consistent but proportionally restrained. The Hofmeister kink in the C-pillar, that little kick at us, the rear of the side window, was present on every model and was a genuine brand signature that car people could point to. The overall proportions were coherent across the lineup. A 3 Series and a 7 Series looked like they came from the same family without looking like the same car. Then something shifted. The grills got bigger. Then they got bigger again. Then they got, and I say this with no exaggeration, enormous. The current grille situation on some BMW models, particularly the 4 Series and the iX, has become something that is extremely hard to describe as consistent with the brand's design heritage. It's consistent in the sense that they've committed to it across multiple new models, but it's a different kind of consistency. It's internal consistency to the current design direction rather than historical consistency to the brand's identity. Whether that's brave design evolution or a mistake is something BMW's sales figures will eventually settle, but from a pure design language standpoint, there's a real question about whether BMW today looks like BMW from 15 years ago in the way that Porsche today looks like Porsche from 15 years ago. And I think honestly the answer is no, not really. What BMW does still do well is the detail-level brand signatures. The Hofmeister kink is still there. The overall approach to body surfacing is still recognizably BMW. But the proportional relationship between the front end and the rest of the car has shifted so dramatically with the new grille sizes that it creates a kind of visual tension that wasn't there before. The cars look like they're wearing someone else's face. I don't know if that's fixable without walking back the design direction, and BMW seems committed to it, so I think we're stuck with it for a while. Rolls-Royce is worth talking about because they represent a very specific kind of design consistency, the kind built on almost total resistance to change. The Pantheon grille, self-leveling spirit of ecstasy, the upright formal proportions, the coach door configuration on the Cullinan and Phantom. Rolls-Royce cars look like Rolls-Royces, and they have done for a very long time. The design language is conservative by any modern standard, but it's consistent in a way that serves the brand's identity perfectly. When you're selling a car that's partly a status symbol, you want it to be immediately recognizable as exactly what it is. Rolls-Royce passes that test absolutely. Nobody in the history of traffic has ever looked at a Phantom and wondered what brand it was. The interesting design challenge Rolls-Royce faces is the Spectre, their first electric car, because the electric drivetrain removes the need for a traditional front grille in terms of cooling, but the Pantheon grille is such a core brand identifier that Rolls-Royce has essentially kept it as a design element even though it no longer serves an aerodynamic function, which is either a brilliant preservation of brand identity or a slightly awkward compromise depending on how you look at it. I think it's the right call for them. The design language is more important to the brand than aerodynamic purity. But it does highlight the tension that electric vehicles create for brands with very grille-heavy design identities. Let me talk about Jeep, because Jeep is an interesting case that doesn't get enough credit in this conversation. The 7-slot grille, the round headlights flanking the grille, the flat hood, the upright windscreen, the boxy silhouette. Jeep has been doing this since the original Willys, and they are still doing it right now. And the visual consistency across 8 decades is genuinely impressive. A Wrangler today is unmistakably related to the original wartime Jeep. That's a design lineage that almost no other brand can match in terms of raw duration. Where Jeep gets complicated is the wider lineup. The Grand Cherokee and the Compass and the Renegade and the Gladiator all have Jeep design elements, but some of them wear them more convincingly than others. The Compass in particular always felt to me like it was doing the Jeep face without fully committing to the Jeep design philosophy. It looked like someone described a Jeep to a designer who had only seen a Jeep once. But the core products, the Wrangler and the Gladiator, have design consistency that puts a lot of more celebrated brands to shame. Aston Martin is one I want to bring up specifically because their story is the cautionary tale version of what happens when you have a strong design language and then spend several years slightly losing the thread of it. The classic Aston Martin design language, particularly the cars from the early 2000s through to the DB11 era, was genuinely beautiful and genuinely consistent. The long bonnet, the short rear deck, the muscular haunches, the sense of restrained British elegance that had just enough aggression to feel sporty. The DB9, the DBS, the Vanquish. These all looked like they belonged together, and they all looked unmistakably like Aston Martins. Then for a period, the design started to drift a bit. Some of the newer models felt less resolved, like they were trying to be more aggressively styled without quite having the vocabulary to do it confidently. The current DBX SUV is a reasonable-looking car, but it doesn't have the same immediate Aston identity that the core sports cars have. More recently, though, the Valhalla and some of the newer concepts suggest the design direction is getting more coherent again. So Aston is in an interesting middle place. Genuinely exceptional historical design language, currently somewhere between consolidating and evolving. I want to talk about Mini because Mini is a genuinely fascinating case study in deliberate design consistency used as a brand strategy. When BMW relaunched Mini in 2001, they made a very conscious decision to base the new car on the visual vocabulary of the original 1959 Mini. Round headlights, the circular motif throughout the interior, the contrast roof, the overall proportions that communicated the same cheeky, compact character as the original, and then they extended that same language across every variant they've added since. The Countryman, the Clubman, the Paceman, the Roadster, every single one of them reads as a Mini. What's interesting about Mini is that the design consistency is almost entirely deliberate retro heritage management rather than organic evolution. They're not developing a design language so much as they're carefully maintaining a very specific visual reference. But the result is the same. If someone shows you any current Mini product, you know immediately what brand it is. The strategy works even if the method is unusual. Lexus is a brand I have a complicated take on. The spindle grille that they introduced around 2012 is genuinely one of the most distinctive design elements any mainstream brand has added in the last 20 years. It's bold, it's unusual, it divides opinion, and it is absolutely a brand identifier. Nobody looks at a current Lexus and confuses it for anything else. In that sense, Lexus has done something impressive. They established a very strong visual identity from essentially a standing start, because for most of their history, Lexus looked pretty generic. Nice cars, well-made, slightly anonymous. The spindle grille changed that. The problem, and it's the same problem BMW is having in a different way, is that the spindle grille is so dominant that it sometimes overwhelms the rest of the design. Everything in the front third of a Lexus is organized around accommodating this enormous central design element, and the cars can feel slightly unbalanced as a result. The LC500 is the exception. That's a genuinely great design where everything works together. But across the lineup, the consistency comes slightly at the cost of proportional harmony. Still, from a pure brand identity standpoint, Lexus has built something real in a fairly short time, which deserves credit. I want to spend a moment on some of the brands that are consistently inconsistent, if that makes sense. Brands where the design language shifts so dramatically between products or between generations that it becomes a defining characteristic of the brand, just not in a good way. Cadillac is the American example of this. Cadillac has had multiple complete design resets in the last 30 years. The sharp-edged art and science language of the early 2000s was distinctive and genuinely interesting. Then it softened. Then it went through a period of trying to split the difference between sporty and luxurious and not quite landing on either. The current generation of Cadillac EVs has a new design direction that's more coherent and more premium feeling. But each of these phases has been so different from the last that there's very little visual through line across Cadillac's design history. You can't look at a 2005 CTS and a 2020 Escalade and a 2025 Lyrique, and identify a consistent design language. They look like cars from 3 different brands. That's a problem. Infiniti is an even more extreme version of this. Infiniti has had multiple design languages, none of which were particularly distinctive, and the brand has basically no visual identity to speak of. I say this not to be harsh, but because it's relevant to the conversation. The absence of design consistency is as instructive as the presence of it. Infiniti makes perfectly good cars that are almost completely anonymous from a design standpoint, and that anonymity has real commercial consequences. Nobody chooses an Infiniti because of the way it looks. That limits your audience pretty significantly. Genesis is worth a brief mention as a brand that's doing the opposite, actively trying to build design consistency from scratch, which is the hardest thing to do. The crest, grille, the twin-line headlights, the overall sense of restrained luxury. Genesis is attempting to create a house style across a relatively new lineup. It's working better than you might expect. The G70 and GV80 and G90 look like they belong to the same family. Whether that family resemblance builds into a true long-term design language or gets reset with the next generation remains to be seen, but the early evidence is better than most new luxury brands manage. Now I want to come back to where I started, which is Porsche, because I think having gone through all of these brands, the Porsche case is even more impressive in context. The challenge of maintaining design consistency while evolving technology, expanding into new segments, responding to new regulations, and serving customers whose tastes change over decades. That challenge is genuinely enormous. Most brands fail at it. BMW failed at it to some degree. Even brands with very strong design heritages like Alfa Romeo went through periods where the language got lost. Porsche has navigated all of those pressures and maintained a design identity that is instantly recognizable across 60+ years of production. That's the answer. That's the brand with the most consistent design language. But I want to give Lamborghini a very strong second place, because what Lamborghini has done with a more extreme and arguably more difficult design vocabulary is genuinely impressive. Porsche's design language is easier to maintain across segments because its relative restraint translates more naturally to an SUV or a saloon. Lamborghini's angular aggression is a much harder language to apply to everyday vehicles, and they've managed it better than they probably had any right to expect. Third, I'd put Rolls-Royce, with the acknowledgement that their consistency comes partly from the deliberate conservation of heritage rather than ongoing design evolution. Which isn't a criticism exactly. It's the right strategy for the brand, but it's a different kind of consistency. And if we're including Jeep in this conversation, which I think we should, they belong in this top tier purely on the strength of duration. 8 decades of a recognizable design identity is an achievement that deserves serious respect regardless of what you think of the products. The brands that have the most to learn from this conversation are probably the German luxury 3, BMW, Audi, and Mercedes, because all 3 of them are currently in the middle of design language experiments that are dividing their existing customer bases and haven't yet built the kind of universal recognition that justifies the risk. BMW's grilles, Audi's transition away from the 4-ring identity, Mercedes' shift toward very large digital surfaces. All of these are gambles. Some of them might pay off. Some of them might be remembered as the period when those brands temporarily lost their visual identity. It's too early to know. But the brands at the top of this list, Porsche, Lamborghini, Rolls-Royce, Jeep, didn't get there by taking those kinds of gambles. They got there by knowing what they looked like and committing to it, generation after generation, regardless of what everyone else was doing. And that, honestly, is the lesson. Design consistency isn't about being boring or resistant to change. It's about having a clear enough sense of your own identity that the changes you make feel like evolution rather than reinvention. The brands that do it best are the ones that could answer the question, "What do we look like?" without hesitation. Most brands, if you asked their design teams that question, would give you a slightly different answer, depending on who in the room you asked. The great ones have one answer, and it shows. Anyway, that's my take. I'm curious whether you agree with Porsche at the top, or whether you think I've got the order completely wrong. Because I have a feeling the Lamborghini versus Porsche debate in particular is going to generate some very strong opinions in the comments. Let me know which brand you think has the most consistent design language, and if you enjoyed this, like and subscribe.